Hey, everybody, welcome to the Aligned Love Podcast. This is the place where I am going to help you find the one thing that you feel is missing: healthy love. I am your host, Lauren Zoller, and in this podcast, I will share with you how to attract love, live in alignment, and elevate your deepest relationships. So buckle up, get present, tune into your body, and open up to the possibility that you truly do get to have it all. Let's dive in. Welcome back to the Aligned Love Podcast. On today's episode, I have Dr. Annie Zimmerman. And Dr. Annie Zimmerman is a psychotherapist, a TikTok personality, and she works with clients from a psychodynamic approach. She has a PhD in psychology and works as a psychotherapist, and her expertise centers on teaching clients how their early lives have formed strategies that might be contributing to unhelpful patterns in adulthood, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Currently, she lives in London, where she sees clients from her private practice, and you can follow her on TikTok and on Instagram at your_pocket_therapist. Annie, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's really exciting to be here.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you. And I know that you're in London and it's the middle of the day there. But before we jump into what I like to call the meat and potatoes of the show, I always like to set an intention for what we want the listeners to walk away with so that they have some sort of an intention to begin listening to this podcast with. So I'm going to hand the reins over to you, and I'm going to ask you to set an intention for our chat today. So does anything come to mind?
I love that as a way to get people to kind of be really present in what it is they're wanting. It's a really nice idea because I feel like we listen to so many things without an intention, but yeah, it's nice to really focus on what it is you're trying to get out of that. So I think my intention would be for people to understand that the way we show up in relationships as an adult is directly informed by how we were in relationship with people as children. Um, and if you want to understand your relationships, if you want to change them and improve them, the real key is to have awareness as to how your childhood shaped you and how those patterns are still showing up in your relationships now. I think if we just all got an education in grounding in the fact that our childhoods are the biggest impactor of our adult relationships, our relationships would change so much and our understanding of how to be different.
Yeah, amen. You are speaking my language. And I know so many people that listen have that awareness because I talk about it all the time, but I am so excited to dive deeper into it. So tell us a little bit about you. I know that you came from a family of therapists, and so you probably felt like this was your track all along. However, I have a lot of friends who are musicians who came from families of musicians, and they're like, I don't want to touch music. So can you tell us a little bit about your story and what inspired you to continue this profession if you grew up in it and you knew all about it growing up?
Yeah, of course. Well, I come from a family of therapists, but they're all different types of therapists. So my mom is a psychodynamic therapist, psychoanalytic therapist like me, but I have others who are CBT, which is more about kind of cognitive thought patterns, and family therapy. So I've understood all different types. And at times that has been, we're very good at talking in my family, sometimes too much. When you're a teenager, you don't really want to be talking in that way. But I think it's almost like being brought up in a religion where everyone has a shared understanding that your childhood is hugely impactful on your adulthood, which is something that I think in the mainstream it's coming up more and people are starting to understand that. But for many people, they just aren't thinking in that way. So it's really important for me to kind of spread that message because I think that's really the key to self-understanding. The reason I got into this therapy really though was through my own experience of therapy. And you'd think growing up with a therapy understanding and a background that I would have understood this, but even then therapy was absolutely life-changing for me, and just opened my eyes to just how much I was being impacted by the past, and how it was just showing up in my patterns and in my relationships. And once you have that realization, not just from an intellectual perspective, but from an emotional perspective, like those aha moments, I think I then was like, oh my God, I need to kind of share this with the world, and I want to spread this information, because I know so many people who are unhappy in their relationships and they don't know why.
Mhm.
Um, and this really feels like the key to me.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what's so beautiful too about the therapy industry as a whole, and I would say that it's a blessing and a curse, is that it's we're always acquiring more information. We know more about the brain, we know more about the physiology of how we are and how we operate as humans, that therapy is always changing and evolving and growing. And I believe too that, I mean, I have a lot of clients who were brought up in families of therapists, and they've never looked at their past, which blows my mind. But so much about what our generation is learning is not what the previous generation of therapists have learned and the way that they operate in their practice. So I think it's beautiful that you brought that up, that that's really something, even though you grew up in a family of therapists, you're always asking more
Mm-hmm.
and you're learning new things, which is really great. So we're going to talk today about how to not let your childhood affect the way that you relate. And we talk a lot about romantic relationships here, but I also speak to platonic relationships, your relationship to self, which is so important. And we're going to do it through the lens of attachment theory.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would love for you to, if you can, kind of dumb it down for us, because we hear about attachment theory all the time. But I would love for you to, if you can, talk about the attachment styles in a really digestible way that people can tangibly hold on to, because oftentimes it's really convoluted and confusing when people hear it at first.
Absolutely, yeah. This was this was a struggle I had in writing my book. I have a chapter on attachment theory, and it's it's been talked about so many times, and I was thinking, what is the best way for people to really understand this? So I made up these two characters, one who is avoidantly attached and one who is anxiously attached, so that instead of just reading about a theory, you can actually see how it creates the change in behavior and the dynamic between them and the struggles and the thoughts they're both having. So I always think learning through stories is the best. But my summary of attachment theory is that it's really about safety. So every baby is born with an attachment system, which means that their number one goal is to stay attached to their parents, because they're so helpless, at least in the first 2 years of life. They need to maintain the attachment to their parents as a matter of life and death. So it's about survival. And they cannot feel safe unless they're being loved and cared for in the way that they need. And because of this, babies are hyper attuned to their parents' moods, the attention that they're getting, their parents' feelings, whether their parents are distant, whether their parents are too close. And they're always adapting, and they learn really quickly to adapt their responses to make sure that that attachment is strong. And this is where attachment styles come in. It's basically the way that you learn to maintain that attachment to your parents when you were a baby. So we can go through the different attachments. I guess there's secure, which is where a baby gets enough care and enough love, to the point where they actually feel so secure in the attachment that they can then go off and play and be creative and know and feel safe that their parent will still be around, both physically and mentally. So they grow up with this sense of confidence in the world, this self-belief that people will always be there. And we call this a secure base. So once you have a secure base, you can then go away from your parents and separate, and it still feels safe. And then there's anxious attachment, which is when usually the parent is inconsistent. So if the parent is sometimes really present and loving, and sometimes really distracted or angry or off at work or just not there, or emotionally, texting on your phone and just kind of vacant, that will feel really stressful for the child, because they're like, where's my parent? I need my parent to survive. So the first response is that they start kind of amping up the crying behaviors, the clinging behaviors. So they'll cry more, they'll try to get attention, they might be more sensitive, and all of this is to make sure that they keep that attachment. And then as an adult, these kind of babies grow up into adults who can't really deal with separation very well, and so they learn to cling, they learn to cry more, or the kind of, I guess, adult version is sending lots of texts or not being able to spend time apart, because they are worried that just because someone's here now, because they're used to inconsistency, they could go at any moment, so the attachment doesn't feel secure. And then the next is avoidance. If a child tries to do the anxious attachment, tries to cling and cry, and it doesn't work, and their parent just really isn't present, and they're really disconnected, eventually the baby stops trying because it's so disappointing to cry and not be responded to, that they just stop crying, and they learn to self-soothe, but not in a healthy way, in a way where they're actually very distressed on the inside, but on the outside they're seeming like they're not bothered, they're avoidant, they're looking away, they don't need anybody. Really they do, but it's just too disappointing to need someone and to not be met. And that turns into an adult, grows into an adult who is very avoidant, who feels very hyper independent. I don't need anybody, doesn't want to spend too much time with people, tends to push people away when they get too close, because for them closeness feels really scary, because it reminds them of being let down so much. So it feels much safer to just deal with everything on their own.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So eye-opening. And I come from a somatic background. And so thinking, and I always use somatic therapy to explain the way that the attachment styles show up in the nervous system and show up in the body. And it's so interesting to me when we talk about this, because you always say attachment is all about safety. It's about safety. And in somatic therapy, we're always working to restore safety. And so I would love to know your take on, because I always say, listen, attachment styles are fantastic. They're wonderful, but they're not to be used as a label, because you can find your way to secure attachment by working through and regulating the nervous system. What are your thoughts, and what's your kind of your stance on attachment theory? Can it be shifted? Is it something that if you label yourself as anxiously attached or avoidantly attached, is that something that you can shift and access deeper security within yourself?
Absolutely. This is one of the many goals of therapy, I guess. And again, I talk about this in my book, that just because you identify with one attachment style, it doesn't mean that that is your attachment style for life, or your attachment style with everybody. So different people can bring out different attachments in you. So you might feel very anxious if you're with someone more avoidant, and you might be able to feel really secure if you're with another secure person. So I think we have to use them to inform our understanding of ourselves and relationships, but not hold on to them so much that they feel like they're a label that we then, our whole life is defined by. Because I think also, just as we grow, we're often much more insecure in our early 20s and in our teen years, and as we grow, people might start to feel more stable and more secure. And so I think it's really important to hold that flexibility. But I'm also really interested in the somatic aspect, because for me, attachment is somatic. Like that sense of stress and safety that a baby experiences, they're not doing it in their thoughts, that they barely have language. It's all physical, it's all in the nervous system. So attachment is the nervous system, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you spoke that you're interested in it, because we talk about it. We talk about it all the time on this podcast, because, the somatic realm is just my world. And even when we're speaking about, having tendencies towards anxious attachment, really it's that sympathetic charge in the system that's constantly fired. And what I think is really interesting about what you spoke about is, with anxious attachment, we talk about going into this crying, this fit of crying, and being in that space of sympathetic charge, being in that fight flight. But if that need, even when crying is expressed, isn't met, and the parent is completely avoidant, then you go into this avoidant attachment, which is, I'm going to go into freeze. I'm going to completely freeze and shut down. So to just be able to see the different spaces of the nervous system and how it shows up in anxious attachment and in avoidant attachment and in the attachment theory in general is just, it's exciting. It's really exciting to see. And it's also really exciting to speak to a psychotherapist who's saying, hey, it's not a label, because I feel that is something, circling back to what we talked about at the beginning. When the book Attached came out, everyone was like, oh, I have avoidant attachment, and that's me. And that's just who I am. And it became almost this crutch of how people would show up in relationship, and they weren't interested in shifting it. They thought that it was just their label. So it feels really comforting to know, even speaking to a psychotherapist, that you're saying, hey, listen, it's a space for curiosity. Let's go deeper and know that it's not it's not your label forever. It just depends on where you are in any given situation with anybody that you're relating to.
Absolutely. And I think we can get really hyper focused on what attachment theory our partner attachment style our partner has and what we have. And, it's almost like that pop psychology quiz where you feel really seen and it's all really simple because this is one attachment style. But there's so many other dynamics in relationships that come into play, like, power, jealousy, anger, like codependency. There's just it's so much more interesting and illuminating to hold your attachment style, but also how does that interact with all of the other things and what else is happening.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. So you speak in your book, and I've geeked out on your book, and I know we're going to talk about it more in just a moment, and everyone that's listening needs to grab a copy. But what I love so much about the book is that you speak about the different stages of relationships. So all the
Hmm.
way from being single to finding the relationship to being in the relationship. And then you also talk about ruptures. So when
Mm.
relationships rupture, how can people use what they know about their childhood and about their attachment dynamics? How can they, and if you just want to briefly touch on them, how can they use that knowledge to navigate all of those different steps when it comes to being in partnership, whether you're single or the relationship is rupturing or you're in it?
Hmm. I think a lot of the time when we act in a relationship, we don't really have an understanding of why. So we're reacting to something that somebody's done, or we're anxious about, someone's not replying, and our responses can often seem like disproportionate, or like we're getting taken over by our emotions, and we don't even know this person, or we're being ghosted, and it feels so painful. And I think, of course, the situations themselves are painful, but almost always a situation like that will trigger something from your past that is unprocessed. And I think holding that awareness when you're having those reactions and it feels like, why am I responding like this? Or why can't I get over somebody? If we just stay in the present of what's happening, it's like a tiny, it's a tiny window. Whereas if we span out into like, okay, what's happened in our past that feels similar to this experience? When else have I felt rejected when I was younger? When else have I felt that I don't know what the signs that how someone else is feeling, and there's not a lot of clarity. And I think by understanding, okay, this mirrors the time that this happened with my sibling when I was younger, or my dad or my mum or whatever, we can actually respond from a much more compassionate place, because it's really our inner child that is reacting. That's how I feel. Um, and therefore we can have empathy rather than just being critical of like, oh, I'm so dramatic, or why am I so sensitive, and we have this critical voice. If we can understand that this is actually coming from something much deeper and something very sensitive and something that we've been carrying and probably repeating for years and years, I think we can then actually approach with curiosity. And be curious is like a huge theme of my book, because it's so important to be able to reflect without judgment about ourselves. That's how we gain self-awareness. Otherwise, it's just another thing we're using to beat ourselves over the head with. So I think having an understanding of your childhood and how that is mapping onto your relationships now is the first step to actually being able to have compassion for yourself and really nitpicking the reactions that we're having rather than just judging them.
Yeah. Yeah. So good. And do you have any sort of suggestion or recommendation for someone that wants to begin this process? Because I know, and I'm sure that you know this too, when you first start out into this self-awareness path, and most of the people that listen have been on this path for a while, but it's really easy to get caught up in your triggers
Hmm.
and to not self-reflect and to not interrupt and to not take time to journal or take time to really get yourself back down to safety and then ask yourself, what just happened? Can I
Hmm.
reflect on it? What do you suggest that people do to interrupt that cycle so that self-awareness can come in?
Hmm. I think it's really hard in the moment when you're triggered. You'll know your nervous system takes over, and it's really, really hard to be reflective in that moment. I mean, it's a cliche, but honestly, therapy for me is the best way to intercept, because sometimes it takes somebody else coming in and pointing something out that you're too kind of caught up in to see. That's really the main aim of therapy, is to help people become more aware of what's unconscious, what they're not realizing. So for example, if you're choosing a partner who's exactly, treats you badly, and that's probably the way that you were treated at some point in your childhood, people might be aware of that, but they're not really seeing the like exact ways that they're responsible for recreating this situation. So I think it can be really helpful to do all those things, to journal, to carve space out, to reflect. But often it takes someone else coming in who's not caught up in the dynamics to be able to see really clearly what else might be going on, and to help you to see what you're kind of too close to it to see.
Mhm.
Of course, not everyone can afford therapy or can have access to therapy, but you can also do this kind of thing for yourself. I think there's a few ways that people have to get in touch with your unconscious. One is to write with your non-dominant hand. So to kind of ask yourself questions, and then that's supposed to help you to respond from a place that you're like less aware of. Things like dreams, they often show you what you're not aware of, but you're kind of is in your pre-conscious. So if you write down your dreams and try to analyze themes that are going on, that can also help you to become aware of a part of yourself that you might not really be conscious of.
Well, I love that. I'm going to try writing with my left hand.
Mhm.
It's going to be a disaster because I am not great. I can barely write anything with my left hand at all. So that'll be a fun exercise. I'm sure that I'm going to try on and other people can try on too. Okay, Annie. So I ask this question on every single podcast, and I love the answers that I get. So I'm not going to escape it with you. You're going to get asked too.
Mhm.
So the name of the podcast is the Align Love Podcast. And I'm curious to know, what does being in an aligned relationship mean to you?
I love that question, and I'm really interested to hear other people's answers. Um, the first thing that came to my mind was reciprocity. I'm very interested in the idea of reciprocity right now. I think it's absolutely essential um, to a healthy relationship. What I understand by reciprocity is that there's an equal amount of effort and love on both sides. So the relationship feels balanced. It doesn't feel like one person is dragging the other person at their speed. It doesn't feel like one person is more interested, where there's that push, that horrible push pull. Um, it's a respect for each other, a respect for the relationship. So a kind of the two of you agreeing that the relationship is the most important thing. Not that it swallows the individual's needs, but both are working to kind of protect the relationship. I think a lot of relationship issues come in where there's a huge imbalance, whether it's an imbalance in power, an imbalance in feelings, an imbalance in, one person's very avoidant, one person's very anxious. So I think holding that reciprocity, and it's not always achievable. Sometimes there are elements, one person might have more money than the other one, or one person is in a different stage of life than the other one. So understanding that it's not always going to be completely equal on every level, but as long as there's both people are willing to work at the same amount of effort for each other and for the relationship, I think that would be an aligned relationship for me.
Yeah. So good. It's what I heard in that is really making, I think there are so many people out there who don't, they're, they're not in it for the relationship. They're in it for their own individual gain. And I don't think I don't think it's something that they consciously do, but there's something to be said for choosing reciprocity and saying, we're going to choose this relationship, and
Right.
we are going to set the intention that this relationship is going to be important. We're going to be
Hmm.
intentional about it. And I think that's beautiful. If you're out there and you're in a relationship and you're not choosing that reciprocity as the cornerstone of how you're showing up every single day and choosing that partnership and that relationship, a lot can start to crumble because it's so easy, right? Especially talking about what we were talking about today with attachment styles and the way that we're triggered, and knowing that I don't care how much therapy you've been in, this is me included, you're going to be triggered for the rest of your life. Like, it's just the way that it goes. This is why you need to be in therapy for the rest of your life. Really, when you're to a certain extent, I think that you need to work through triggers. You shouldn't have
Hmm.
a therapist for the rest of your life, but when a trigger does arise, that's what a therapist is for. Go work through it.
Mm.
But having that cornerstone of saying, hey, we're going to choose the relationship. And even if it means that we show up and we're not our best selves that day, the relationship is still going to be the cornerstone. So I love that so
Right.
much.
And I think the problem is that when you're triggered, you're inherently selfish.
Yeah.
Like when you're triggered, you are thinking about you don't feel safe. So you're thinking about your own needs. And it's, I guess, responding to a trigger from an adult place rather than child place is thinking about your needs and the needs of a relationship. And this
Mm,
goes for both anxious and avoidant. That the avoidant person is so scared and needs so much space to feel safe that they forget about how that is impacting the other person. And the anxious person needs so much closeness and reassurance and validation that they forget about how that might be impacting the other person. So it's about understanding your needs when you're triggered, but also being able to hold the relationship in mind and the other person. And that's like a huge skill that can take a lot of work to develop.
mm. Yeah. Yeah. I think it was Dr. Nicole LaPera who said that the the new love language, the sixth love language, if you will, is understanding your partner's trauma and
Mm-hmm.
holding space for it. And that speaks to that as well. Really understanding, saying, hey, the relationship is the number one. We're still going to be individuals, but if we're choosing this, that also means that we have to choose each other in our trauma and in our responses. And I just love it. I think that that's one of my favorite answers of what it means to be in an aligned relationship. So I love that so much. So talk to us about this book. I know that I have my hands on it already and I have been binging it. I love it so much. But can you tell us a little bit more about it and what's in your words? Because I could talk about it all day, but I would love to know in your words why you wrote it, why you're passionate about it, and what it's about.
Of course, yeah, it's really exciting to finally be able to talk about it. So it's called Your Pocket Therapist, and the idea is really what it says on the tin. It's summarizing complex psychological theory about relationships, about how our childhood impacts us, about lots of different mental health problems that we all go through: anxiety, depression, addictions, but summarizing it into a kind of simple way that is easy to understand with practical tips and stories from therapy so that you can really understand how people actually work through these things and heal, but without it being jargony and scientific. So I guess the aim of my Instagram, my TikTok, and this book really is to educate people in a way that feels really easy to digest, but without losing the complexity. Because I think there's a lot of self-help books, there's a lot of Instagram therapy which doesn't hold the depth which people are yearning for. And this is the space that I kind of was intentional about in starting my social media, because I thought, there's so much stuff on Instagram and a lot of it is really like positive kind of schmaltzy quotes. But the stuff that I was learning about when I was training is so deep and dark and interesting and nuanced and sensitive. And I really wanted to have a space that could hold all of that, because I think people, our generation and the younger generations are so keen to learn about their mental health and about relationships and psychology, and that the simple things, they understand that now and they're really interested in depth and complexity and getting to the nitty gritty of it all. So my aim with the book is really to present all that in a way that's actually really simple to read. It's not complex, there's not a lot of jargon, but still you're getting like a big education on like this deep psychology elements. And then mostly it focuses on relationships, which is the area where I'm really passionate about and where I think most people are wanting to learn about, because it's our relationships where a lot of our suffering and a lot of our past traumas come up.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, you've done it beautifully. The book is so incredible. And I'll say that if you are a lot of people that follow me, they want to learn more. They want to learn more about how psychology works and how it shows up in relationships. And so if you are listening, go grab this book, because it truly, when you say, Dr. Zimmerman, that you make it tangible and easy for people to digest and understand, you hit the nail on the head. And I feel like there's so much complexity in psychology and the way that things are portrayed to us. And there's a lot of false information on the internet. And it's really refreshing to be able to read this in a way that is tangible and know that it's solid information. It's coming from a really great source. So everyone go run, grab the book. We are going to put in the show notes how you can get it. And Dr. Zimmerman, thank you so much for being on the show. This was so enlightening. And we're going to have you back again, because it's so incredible. And I know that so many people are going to learn so much about their attachment style and how they can start to shift that so that they don't carry that into the way that they relate both in platonic and romantic relationships. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been so nice to talk to you.
Yeah, you too. That wraps up today's episode of the Aligned Love podcast. One thing that would really help me and the other new potential listeners is for you to rate this show and leave a comment wherever you tune in and listen. Also, make sure to link up with me on Instagram at Lauren Zoller, and please share this podcast with anyone who you think may enjoy it. Until next episode, remember, every transformation begins with one moment of awareness, and I hope today has been yours. I'll see you next time.